The road was nearly invisible under the twilight. Rain had just washed the asphalt, leaving a slick surface that mirrored the lonely amber streetlights. A middle-aged man sat behind the wheel, his eyes fixed on the rhythmic sweep of the wipers. Suddenly, his headlights caught a flash of movement. He slowed down. There, huddled against a rusted guardrail, was a teenage girl. She was sobbing, her head buried in her knees. Beside her lay a shattered smartphone. Thomas looked at his watch. He was late to pick up his son. He could have driven away, but he stopped. He rolled down the window and asked, "Are you okay?" He had no idea this simple question would change his life forever. Thomas Reed was 42 years old, and if you asked him to describe himself, he would say he was a man who lived in the shadows of the machinery. For nearly a decade, he had worked as the lead maintenance man for a sprawling, somewhat tired apartment complex on the edge of the city. His hands were permanently stained with the faint scent of machine oil and industrial cleaner, marks of a life spent fixing things that others had broken. He was the man people called when a pipe burst at 3 a.m. or when a heater failed in the dead of winter. He was essential to the building's survival, yet he remained almost entirely invisible to the people living inside it. They saw his tool belt and his gray uniform, but they rarely saw his face. Thomas lived a life measured in small, quiet increments. His world had shrunk significantly since his wife had walked out the door 5 years ago, leaving him to navigate the complexities of single parenthood alone. Since then, every decision he made was viewed through the lens of his son, Evan. Evan was 10 years old, a bright, observant boy who was the sun around which Thomas's entire universe orbited. Every repair Thomas made, every extra hour of overtime he clocked, was a brick in the wall he was building to protect Evan from a world that could be cold and indifferent. Thomas didn't consider himself a hero. He wasn't a man of high education or grand ambitions. He didn't dream of corner offices, expensive cars, or international travel. His dreams were much humbler. He dreamed of a week where no major appliances broke in the complex. He dreamed of saving enough to take Evan to the coast for a weekend to see the ocean. He dreamed of a quiet life where peace was the highest currency. He had become comfortable with the idea that he wasn't important in the grand scheme of things. He was the person nobody noticed at the grocery store, the man whose opinion was never sought in town hall meetings, and the father who stood quietly at the back of the school gymnasium during assemblies. He had convinced himself that staying under the radar was the safest way to live. If you don't expect much from the world can't disappoint you. That was the unspoken motto he lived by. But on this specific evening, as the rain-slicked road blurred beneath his tires, he found himself thinking about Evan more than usual. He remembered a Tuesday afternoon 3 months ago when Evan had come home from school with a bruised lip and eyes red from crying. Some older boys had cornered him near the bike racks, and while dozens of parents and teachers had walked past, not one adult had stopped to ask why a 10-year-old was being shoved into the dirt. That memory burned in Thomas's chest like a slow-moving ember. He remembered the crushing helplessness he felt as a father, wishing someone, anyone, had just looked his son in the eye and stood up for him. As he looked at the girl on the side of the road, Thomas realized he couldn't be one of those people who just kept driving, even if it meant being late, even if it meant breaking his own rule about staying invisible. He realized that for this girl, in this moment, he might be the only bridge back to safety. The wind began to howl, pushing the damp air through the cracks in his window. Thomas felt a shiver, but it wasn't from the cold. It was the realization that life often presents us with a choice, to be a bystander or to be a participant. For 42 years, Thomas had been a bystander. He had watched the world from the sidelines, fixing the pipes while the world moved on. But as he looked at the girl's trembling shoulders, he knew he couldn't just watch anymore. He put the car in park, the engine idling with a low, steady thrum, and stepped out into the rain. The girl's name was Lily, and she was 16 years old, though at that moment she felt like she was 1,000. She had spent the last hour running until her lungs burned and her legs gave out. The argument at home had been the worst one yet, a culmination of months of rising tension and unspoken resentment. Since her mother had remarried a year ago to a man who valued order over emotion, the house had felt less like a home and more like a courtroom where Lily was always the defendant. Her stepfather was a man of cold logic and sharp words, a man who saw Lily's teenage emotions as a structural flaw in his perfect new family. He didn't understand her art, her silence, or her occasional outbursts of grief for the father she had lost years ago. That night, the tension had finally snapped. He had called her a burden, a weight that was dragging her mother down into a life of constant stress. And the most painful part wasn't the insult itself. It was the silence from her mother that followed it. That silence was a betrayal that cut deeper than any shout. Lily had grabbed a small backpack, stuffed a hoodie and a notebook inside, and bolted out the door into the storm. She had no plan. She had no money. She just knew she couldn't stay in a place where she was viewed as a liability rather than a daughter. By the time Thomas pulled over, Lily was at her absolute breaking point. Her phone had died minutes after she fell on the slick pavement, and the shattered screen felt like a perfect metaphor for her life. Broken, dark, and useless. When Thomas approached her, he didn't do what most adults did. He didn't start with a lecture about the dangers of being out late. He didn't demand to know her name or where she lived in that commanding tone she was used to hearing. Instead, he reached into the back seat and pulled out a clean, unopened bottle of water and his own heavy work jacket, which still smelled faintly of the laundry detergent Evan liked. He walked over slowly, keeping a respectful distance so as not to startle her. He sat down on the damp ground about 5 feet away, mirroring her posture. He didn't look at her directly. He looked at the broken phone on the pavement. "It's a cold night for a walk," he said softly, his voice barely rising above the sound of the wind. Lily didn't answer at first. She just stared at the jacket he had placed between them. Slowly, the wall of her defense began to crumble. The silence of the night was filled with the sound of her starting to tell him everything. She talked about the feeling of being an outsider in her own living room. She talked about the weight of her stepfather's expectations and the sting of her mother's indifference. She spoke of the father she missed and the girl she used to be before the world became so complicated. Thomas just listened. He didn't interrupt with advice. He didn't tell her that things would get better or that she was being dramatic. He just sat there, a quiet, solid presence in the dark, absorbing her pain as if it were his own. He knew what it was like to feel forgotten. He knew the weight of a silence that felt like a wall. When she finally looked up, her face streaked with dirt and tears, she asked him a question that caught him off guard. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me. You could have been anyone." Thomas looked at his hands, the grease under his fingernails visible in the dim light of the street lamp. "Because someone once didn't help my son," he replied honestly. "And I promised myself I wouldn't let that happen to anyone else if I could help it. Sometimes we help others because we know exactly how much it hurts when no one helps us." He eventually convinced her to let him drive her to a nearby police station, a safe haven where he knew social services could be contacted. He didn't want to take her back to the house she had fled from. Not yet. He waited in the lobby for 3 hours, refusing to leave until he saw a female officer sit down with Lily and offer her a warm meal and a blanket. He watched through the glass as Lily's posture relaxed for the first time that night. Once he knew she was in the hands of people who could actually help her, Thomas slipped out the door. He didn't leave a name. He didn't ask for a reward. He just drove home, tucked Evan into bed, and went to sleep, thinking that he had simply performed a small, forgotten act of kindness in a world that desperately needed more of them. The next morning started with the familiar, mundane sounds of his life. The sun was a pale, watery disk behind the clouds, and the smell of coffee filled Thomas's small kitchen. He dropped Evan off at school, giving him a firm high five and a reminder to be kind, then headed to the apartment complex. He was halfway through repairing a leaky faucet in Unit 4B, his mind still drifting back to the girl on the road, when his radio crackled to life. The property manager, a usually gruff and impatient man named Mr. Henderson, told Thomas to report to the main office immediately. Thomas felt a cold knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. In his world, being called to the office by Henderson usually meant one of two things: a budget cut or a layoff. He wondered if his being late the night before had somehow been reported. He wiped his hands on a rag, adjusted his tool belt, and walked toward the leasing office with a heavy heart. He was already rehearsing his apology, thinking about the rent he still owed and the shoes Evan needed for gym class. When he entered, he saw Mr. Henderson standing by the window, looking uncharacteristically nervous. Sitting in the guest chair was a woman Thomas had never seen before. She was dressed in a sharp, professional charcoal suit, her hair pulled back in a neat, severe bun. She looked like someone who moved in circles far above Thomas's pay grade, someone who made decisions that affected thousands of people. As Thomas walked in, she stood up and looked at him with an intensity that made him want to look at the floor. "This is Thomas Reed," Henderson said, his voice unusually soft, almost deferential. The woman stepped forward and extended her hand. "Mr. Reed, my name is Dr. Helen Moore. I am a clinical psychologist and a senior consultant for the city's youth crisis department." Thomas shook her hand, his mind racing. Did I do something wrong last night? Did the police think I was the reason she ran away? He was prepared for an interrogation, for a lecture on why maintenance men shouldn't pick up teenagers on the side of the road. But Dr. Moore didn't look angry. Her eyes were searching, filled with a mixture of relief and a profound, raw gratitude that seemed to bridge the gap between their social classes. "My daughter, Lily, told me everything that happened last night," she said, her voice cracking slightly. Thomas froze. The girl from the road wasn't just any teenager. She was the daughter of one of the most prominent child advocates in the city. He felt a wave of embarrassment wash over him. "I just wanted to make sure she was safe," he stammered, his face flushing. "I didn't mean to overstep. I know I'm just a stranger, but she looked so lost." Dr. Moore shook her head, tears shimmering in her eyes. "Mr. Reed, you didn't overstep. You did something that I, as a mother and a professional, have been failing to do for months. You listened. Lily has been struggling with severe clinical depression for a long time. Last night wasn't just a runaway attempt. She had reached a point of no return. She had decided that the world was better off without her. If you hadn't stopped, if you hadn't sat on that wet ground and just let her speak without judging her, I don't think I would be seeing her today. You stopped my daughter from disappearing forever. You gave her a reason to believe that there is still kindness in the world. Thomas didn't know what to say. He had always viewed his life as a series of small, insignificant tasks: fixing sinks, painting walls, changing light bulbs. He never imagined that a simple conversation could carry the weight of a human life. It was a staggering thought, one that made the pipes and tools in his belt feel suddenly very light. But Dr. Moore wasn't finished. She explained that for years, she had been trying to find people who had the natural temperament to work with at-risk youth. People who didn't lead with authority, ego, or academic theories, but with genuine, quiet empathy. She told him that Lily had described him as the first person in years who didn't try to fix her, but simply acknowledged her existence. "Mr. Reed, our department is launching a new community outreach initiative," Dr. Moore continued, regaining her professional composure. "We need people who can walk into difficult situations and provide a calming presence. We need people who understand what it means to be overlooked and unheard. I want to offer you a position as a lead community liaison. It would involve working with teenagers in crisis, helping them find their footing before they fall through the cracks of the system. It pays twice what you're making here, and we will provide all the professional training you need." Thomas felt the room spin. He looked at Mr. Henderson, who was nodding encouragingly, clearly impressed by the turn of events. He looked back at Dr. Moore. "But I'm just a maintenance man," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't have a degree. I don't know how to be a counselor. I'm used to fixing things with a wrench, not words." Dr. Moore smiled, and for the first time, Thomas saw the kindness in her expression. "You don't need a degree to be a human being, Thomas. You were exactly what my daughter needed when the rest of the world was looking the other way. That is the only qualification that truly matters." Thomas spent the next 24 hours in a state of quiet, vibrating shock. The weight of the decision felt heavier than any piece of industrial machinery he had ever moved. He sat in his small living room after Evan had gone to sleep, the offer letter from Dr. Moore sitting on the coffee table like a glowing artifact from another dimension. He was terrified. He was a man who thrived on routine, on the predictable nature of mechanical failure. He knew how to fix a boiler because a boiler followed laws of physics. He didn't know how to navigate the fragile, chaotic landscapes of the human soul. He was afraid of failing. He was afraid that if he stepped out of his invisible life, he would be exposed as someone who wasn't smart enough or capable enough for real work. He spent the night staring out the window at the rain, which had returned as a light drizzle. He kept thinking about Lily's face when he had offered her the jacket. He thought about the way her voice had changed from a scream of despair to a whisper of hope as she realized she wasn't alone. He realized that for 42 years he had been hiding behind his own humility, using his unimportance as a shield to keep the world at arm's length. The next morning, as he was making breakfast, Evan noticed his father's distant gaze. The boy was always more perceptive than Thomas gave him credit for. "Dad, are you okay?" Evan asked, unaware that he was echoing the very words that had started this entire chain of events. Thomas looked at his son, seeing the same vulnerability and strength that he saw in the kids Dr. Moore wanted him to help. He decided to tell Evan the whole story. He told him about the girl, the rain, and the lady in the charcoal suit. He told him about the new job, and most importantly, how scared he was to take it. Evan listened with the kind of intense, unwavering focus that only children possess. When Thomas finished, the house was silent for a long moment, save for the ticking of the kitchen clock. Then Evan reached across the table and touched his father's rough, calloused hand. "Dad, you always tell me to help people when I can," he said. "You say that being a man means standing up for others even when it's hard. If you don't take the job, Aren't you doing the opposite of what you taught me?" The words hit Thomas with the force of a physical blow. He realized that he had been teaching his son to be brave while choosing a life of quiet retreat for himself. He was asking Evan to be a hero in his own life, while Thomas was content to be a ghost. In that moment, the fear didn't disappear, but it became smaller, a manageable thing compared to the responsibility he felt toward his son. He realized that the most dangerous thing he could do wasn't taking the new job. It was staying exactly where he was and letting his potential wither away in the shadows of an apartment basement. He picked up the phone and called Dr. Moore. "I'll do it," he said, his voice firm for the first time in years. "I don't know if I'll be good at it, but I'll give it everything I have." The transition wasn't easy. The first few months of training were some of the most grueling of Thomas's life. He had to learn to translate his natural instincts into professional protocols. He had to sit in classrooms with people half his age who spoke in a language of sociology and psychology that felt alien to him. There were days when he felt like an imposter, a man wearing a suit that didn't fit, a fraud who should have stayed with his pipes and wrenches. But then came the first day in the field, away from the textbooks and the lectures. He was sent to a local high school to talk to a boy named Marcus, who had stopped coming to class. Marcus spent his days sitting in the park, staring at nothing, his eyes filled with a hollow darkness that Thomas recognized instantly. When Thomas walked up to him, he didn't introduce himself as a counselor. He didn't pull out a clipboard or start asking questions from a list. He just sat down on the bench, looked at the boy's worn-out sneakers and said, "It looks like you've been walking a long way. Do you want to sit for a while?" The boy looked up, and for the first time in weeks, someone saw him. Within an hour, they were talking. Not about school or grades, but about broken families, lost dreams, and the best way to fix a bicycle chain. Thomas realized that his years of being invisible were actually his greatest asset. He knew what it felt like to be ignored, and that shared experience was a bridge that no academic degree could ever build. He wasn't talking to Marcus as a professional. He was talking to him as a man who had been in the dirt, too. As the months turned into a year, Thomas's life transformed in ways he never could have predicted. He moved Evan into a better school district where the bike racks were safe and the teachers were attentive. He started a small garden in their new backyard, teaching Evan how to grow things from the earth. He found himself being invited to city-wide meetings where people actually leaned in when he spoke. But the most significant change wasn't the salary, the new house, or the professional respect. It was the way he looked at himself in the mirror every morning. He no longer saw a man who was just waiting for things to break. He saw a man who was actively participating in the mending of the world. Lily eventually recovered and returned to school, her path lit by the steady support of her mother and the knowledge that a stranger had cared enough to stop. She and Thomas stayed in touch through occasional letters, small updates on her progress that Thomas kept tucked in his desk drawer like precious artifacts. They were the evidence that his life had meaning beyond the mechanical. One evening, nearly 2 years after that rainy night, Thomas was driving Evan home from a baseball game. The sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the road, turning the asphalt into a river of light. They passed the very spot where he had found Lily. The guardrail was still rusted, and the streetlights were beginning to flicker on. Evan looked out the window and then turned to his father, his eyes reflecting the twilight. "Dad, why did you really stop that night? I mean, you were late, and it was raining, and you could have just called the police from your phone. Why did you actually get out of the car?" Thomas slowed the car down, his eyes scanning the horizon. He thought about the maintenance man he used to be, the man who thought he didn't matter. He thought about Marcus, Lily, and the hundreds of kids he had talked to since then. He realized that every single one of those stories began with a moment of silence, a moment where someone chose to see or chose to look away. Because sometimes, stopping is the bravest thing you can do, Thomas said quietly. In a world that tells everyone to keep moving, to keep rushing, and to mind their own business, choosing to pause for someone else is an act of rebellion. It's a way of saying that the person in front of you is more important than the schedule you're trying to keep. It's a way of saying that no one is truly invisible. Evan nodded, looking out at the road with a new kind of understanding. The road ahead was long, and the shadows were deepening, but inside the car, there was a warmth that had nothing to do with the heater. Thomas Reed was no longer just a man fixing things in the dark. He was a man who had learned that the most important repairs don't happen in the walls of an apartment complex. They happen in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, in the simple act of asking if someone is okay, and in the courage to stay until the answer comes. His life had changed forever, not because of a miracle, but because of a choice. And as he drove into the night, he knew that he would never be invisible again. If you believe one small act can save a life, subscribe to High TL Stories. We tell stories of healing and hope, places where a single moment of pausing can change an entire future for the better.